Dogman and Dinosaurs? Dear Scary Stories NYC. When I was a kid, my father and grandfather told me stories about wolf-headed werewolves and dinosaurs still existing in the Pacific after WW2. I thought the stories were funny and that they proved that I came from a family of mentally disturbed people. I wasn't ashamed of it. I figured that with my intelligence and my family's insanity, I'd be certain to grow up to be a trailblazer. Then, far more recently, I had my own Dogman experience, which has thrown my entire perception of myself and my family into question. I come to you to bare my soul and confess the entire history for you to judge. The following should either convict us as sane or insane, and each of those decisions on your part come with a different range of consequences and implications. Let's start with my grandfather's WW2 Dogman story. I first heard it from my father, but when I heard it again later from both my father and my grandfather, the older one edited and corrected a number of details that my dad had gotten wrong. For instance, Dad told me that at the very end of WW2, Grandpa ended up shipwrecked on a South Pacific island entirely alone with werewolves. In fact, according to Grandpa, he was stranded on the island with 3 other American Navy men. When my father told the story, I got the impression it was tiny, like one of those desert islands in the magazine cartoons with 2 men and a coconut tree. When Grandpa told it, though, he and the other men were stranded on an island that they eventually judged to be about twice the size of Central Park in Manhattan and almost entirely covered in tropical vegetation. A jungle island like in the movie King Kong, and holding just as many surprising kinds of flora and fauna. I could sort of accept the story so far in basic principle. It was a bit on the land of the lost side, but nothing so far had happened that was impossible. It was the next part that caused me to start doubting it all. It was when I asked Grandpa if there were other men on the island. The way he answered made me wonder if he was out of his mind. He told me that there weren't men like you and me, but there were men with dog heads there. Or more properly, men with heads like those of wolves. According to my grandfather, they had to deal with the wolf-headed men from their very first night on the island. Grandpa and his fellow sailors had located a small cave to sleep in. He said it was really more of an alcove at the bottom of a hill, filled with spiders and barely large enough to keep the 3 men out of the rain. But it was their shelter until sun came up and they could look for a better one. That first night, Grandpa said that one of the other guys woke him up, saying that there was someone throwing little rocks at him inside the cave. He joined the guy as they snuck around in front and down, trying to figure out who else was there in that area with them. They assumed it was human beings because most animals and plants don't throw rocks at you while you're trying to sleep. Then suddenly, Grandpa said he surprised the culprit, and the rock thrower triple surprised Grandpa. This was the first time my grandfather saw the Dogman, or the werewolf, or whatever you'd like to call it. When I saw him talk about this experience, I saw the man look extremely pained. I saw him appear to be taking ill. Just remembering that incident drained him, and that should have caused me to realize that he meant every word he was saying. I was kind of a smart-mouthed brat at the time, though, so the more Grandpa got himself scared with his own story, the funnier it seemed to me. Instead of signaling to me that the man was being genuine, I just took it as a sign that older people have bats in their belfry. If I could go back in time and give myself advice, I would tell the younger version of me to be more respectful of my elders. Of course, then the younger version of me would laugh at how dumb the older version of him would get to be. So, Grandpa and the other sailor were confronted with this beast with glowing eyes, this wolf-headed manimal with fangs that Dracula would be jealous of and claws that could let the air out of any car's tires. Besides telling me how the eyes glowed like the eyes of a ghost, the only other description I got of the face or head of the beast was that it looked like a wild wolf, extremely agitated and furious at every moment whenever he would see it. Like sometimes Grandpa would explain you might spot a big snake, but it might not be in your way, or you might come across some other kind of predator, but you were able to stay off their radar. With the dog-headed men, however, seeing them was always a problem 100% of the time, because they seemed agitated at human presence and quite clear that they viewed Grandpa and the other men as an invasive species. The four of them scouted out the edges of the island and began to cautiously make brief excursions inward in search of food, shelter, and drinkable water. After a while, they occupied one beach and did their best to avoid the Dogmen as they rolled stones and boulders out onto the sand to spell SOS for any passing pilots to see. They were cut off from all news, and in fact, according to the way the story was told to me, the men didn't even learn that WW2 had ended until they were later rescued. They had no radio, no telephone, no electricity, and no sure measurement of how long they were even stuck there, although Grandpa was certain already by this point that it had been for months. On their excursions inward into the jungle, Grandpa claimed they would see what he called tiny lizard men. From his descriptions, they sounded like small dinosaurs to me. But the island residents he was always most fixated on talking about were the big, furry, dog-faced man-like ones, the Dogmen. One facet of the legends as they were passed down to me was that each time the men saw a Dogman, they always felt surrounded, or that they were in the process of becoming surrounded. It became policy to immediately retreat upon sight of any of the wolfmen, after an incident in which Grandfather claimed they almost all got torn into pieces. On that day, the men were especially hungry, and were joined together, all four of them, on an excursion into the jungle in search of edibles and drinkables. The man in the lead whispered that he had a Dogman in his sights. The others looked and could see a small clearing with a tree in the center of it. Standing upright bipedally next to that tree was, in fact, one of the wolf-headed humanoids. The men devised a plan to sneak forward and around the creature and then do him in. They were clearly very threatened by the presence of the Dogman. For them to have ceased their search for food while they were hungry to attempt to nullify the threat of that one creature. Fear of the Dogman was stronger to them than hunger itself. That fear almost cost them all their lives. The men crept up on the clearing with the tree in the center of it. When they charged into the small field, however, the Dogman was suddenly no longer anywhere around. They met under the tree in the center of the clearing to discuss strategy, unsure of what had just happened. Grandpa said he and the others all heard branches snapping above them, causing them to dive away from the tree and run away a second before they would have been fallen upon by four large Dogmen, one for each man, each larger than the last one. According to Grandpa, the Dogmen pounded their chests and the ground, screaming and shouting in an extremely intimidating manner as the men ran away. The creatures did not pursue, but seemed to be making a point about their turf. Grandpa said the men steered clear of that clearing and almost all of the interior of the island from then on. According to Grandpa, there were a lot of strange and unknown beasts that survived into the 1940s, but not past the post-war era of the 50s for various reasons. I've never, as in never, heard this theory repeated by any reputable source anywhere in the world. You will find it present in fiction, but not in any works of human or natural history. Even when I was 13, I already knew that nobody anywhere was claiming that wolf-headed men ever lived, even in prehistory, but certainly not in the 20th century on a Pacific island somewhere. But if the werewolf idea seemed preposterous to me, it just showed my narrow-mindedness, because Grandpa was just getting started. He also claimed that the island was inhabited by various kinds of dinosaurs. Now, I had to give his imagination credit for most of the dinos he described, as he didn't claim he saw a Tyrannosaurus rex. He said they had various smaller dinos that reminded him of roadrunners, and a 5-foot-tall dino shaped something like an ostrich. Where his story went over the top was when he got to the water-bound, meat-eating brontosauruses, or brontosauri, that surrounded them in the seas around the island. I told Grandpa that Brontosaurus had legs like an elephant and walked. It did not swim. Also, it had teeth, which proved it was a vegetarian and not a carnivore. In response, Grandpa said that the one he saw had fangs, and the one he saw seemed to dine on a mixed diet of fish and monkeys it picked off out of the trees on the shoreline. According to Grandpa, the Brontosaurus's neck functioned like a snake, able to strike suddenly like a cobra and seize prey as large or larger than a grown man. If he actually saw anything and was not just making this story up, it could not have been a brontosaur that he saw, because the neck of a bronto was not built like a snake. It could never have moved as he described, without the animal probably choking himself to death. The same can be said of the plesiosaur, a long-necked water creature from prehistory who sometimes gets accused of being the Loch Ness Monster. So, I do not know what kind of animal or dinosaur could have had the size and neck length of a brontosaurus, yet the savage man-eating hunger of the tyrannosaur. The only creatures I know that move like snakes are snakes, and yet this giant animal was said to have had a body like a brontosaurus, from which its carnivorous, snake-like head and neck protruded outward from. I'm going to call the big guy a bronto because that's what Grandpa called him, but I know it couldn't have actually been a brontosaur. So, the apex Dogman story that Grandpa had in his repertoire, and the one my father also liked most to retell, was the one about the dogman that got into a battle with one of these sharp-toothed, long-fanged, aquatic water brontos out on the beach at the edge of the human turf. I forget if it was sundown or sunrise, but this story was supposed to happen in subdued orange light, as the sky was turning all sorts of colors dramatically. The men had been alerted to some thrashing in the waves and terrible noises. Fearing some human being attacked, the men quickly made their way toward the beach and peered out, only to see two very large sea animals engaged in a terrible battle just off the shoreline. One of them was this bronto beast we had been discussing, and the other was something scaly and fish-like, but not any kind of sea life any of the men had been familiar with. They watched with curiosity, as sometimes remnants of such battles wash ashore and are good after being roasted long enough over an open fire. But the men weren't the only scavengers hiding out at the edges of this terrific water fight. Some kind of seafood or another came flying onto the beach due to the bronto winning the fight. The men were tempted to go after the free meal, but the victor was too close to the beach, and they judged it as not being worth the risk to their lives. The other scavenger in attendance was more willing to take the chance, though, and the men saw one of the large wolf-headed dogmen run out of the jungle onto the beach, racing across the sand and grabbing that seafood in his large, clawed monster hand. As he turned to run away with his prize, however, a shadow fell upon the dogman, and the long, giant, snake-like neck of the apparent dinosaur came down toward the bipedal wolf-headed caveman. Grandpa said he saw the look of shock and horror on the dogman's face as the jaws of the lightning-fast sea bronto closed sideways around him from just below his shoulders down almost to his midsection. Then, the water monster's head whipped backward, flipping the dogman so far in the air that I wondered if there was oxygen up there. There certainly wasn't very much of it under the water, which is where the wolf-headed man eventually splashed down. Grandpa described other sea brontos appearing as if from nowhere and dining on the dogman. You could understand why the men avoided the waters surrounding the island. As I got a little older, I became even more of a little snot, you know. I would make fun of my grandfather and father to my tough guy friends, and they would say they didn't believe me. My grandfather came to stay with us for a week, and so I brought two of the guys home to hear his dinosaurs versus werewolves stories. Well, once Grandpa figured out that my friends thought his stories were funny, he kicked us all out of the house for the night. Of course, that only made us laugh even more. I had proven to my friends that I hadn't made it up. My family really was crazy. That was the last time I saw my grandfather. I missed the man, but I had no regrets about having ended my relationship with him in the way I did. I mean, clearly he was crazy. And so what was the harm in me teasing him a little about it? That didn't mean I didn't love him. It just meant that it was funny that he was so bizarre. That was really how I felt about it. And I mean for years, too. Fast forward all the way to 2020. My wife and I both were able to take extended leaves of absence and go camping deep in the wilderness. I had never done this in my life, and so we were camping with an expert. He was armed and in charge, while my wife and I were basically his slaves for the duration. In the beginning it was tiring but rewarding. However, things sort of fell apart after we all saw a dogman, a wolf-headed caveman, just as my grandfather had described to me, and just as I had mocked him for sincerely telling me about. No, we were not hiking through the islands of the South Pacific. We were in Titusville, New Jersey when we saw the dogman. We had been camping and hiking off-trail in the Bald Pate Mountains, which is just on the other side of the Delaware River from Pennsylvania. We were marching along, and I had been jabbering on about something that I found interesting. Suddenly our guide's large hand was covering my mouth, and my wife was dragging me down behind some foliage. The two of them were protecting me from something, but I hadn't seen what. I tried to peek around the edge of the bush, but when I did, the guide would pull my head back into hiding. I was getting annoyed at being treated like a child, yet I knew if I acted out, I might get us all into trouble. Assuming that there really was a threat out there, and I wasn't just being made a fool of, I heard my wife whisper, asking the guide, "Where did it go?" In response, he just shrugged and peeked out, looking left and right. While this happened, I got dripped on by some kind of liquid. Looking up to find the source, I saw a large, hair-covered, naked man with the head of a wolf dangling from some branches well over my head, his tongue hanging out of his fang-filled mouth, his glowing eyes staring blankly at me as he drooled hungrily. This was exactly what my grandfather had lived with on that island in the previous century. This was exactly what I had mocked him for telling me about. My brain kind of locked into place, and I froze in position. When my wife and the guide noticed me looking upward, they finally looked up too and saw what I was seeing. And it was the same thing they had seen earlier. The same thing they were trying to protect me from. It was the wolf-headed dogman. We ran back to our camp, and the three of us piled into the tent that my wife and I were using. I don't actually remember running back, so I can't even tell you if the dogman pursued us or just let us go. I just remember being back inside the tent And then once our guide had zipped it up and I felt a sense of security, I kind of fell apart. I needed some time to let my emotions out. I thought I was close enough with my wife that I could be open and fragile in her presence, but that was childish and unrealistic of me. Now, I had a more severe emotional reaction to the experience than the other two, because for me it wasn't only a terrifying thing that happened. For me, it also meant that my family wasn't crazy at all. Werewolves really did exist. My family were just normal guys who saw something that other normal guys didn't believe in. The only thing that was different about them was that they saw something that most people don't see. Me seeing that Dogman, and me hearing from my wife and that professional guide that they saw it too, that meant that Grandpa and Dad were not crazy, which also meant I had not inherited insanity, which explained why I never grew up into the innovative pioneer I had expected to become. I had just become a normal guy with a normal job because I had come from a background of normal, average, hard-working, regular folks. And now I, like those in my family before me, had a life-changing encounter with a Dogman. It was so humbling that I had a kind of an emotional breakdown. I tried to keep a lid on it and keep it a personal epiphany, but our guide began making jokes about how little it takes to bring me to tears, and my wife was laughing at his jokes. As it turned out, she preferred athletic outdoorsmen who know what to do in any situation to weepy office clerks who fall apart every time their paradigm gets altered. I knew in that moment that my marriage was over, and I was right. We're still not officially divorced, but it was over on that day, believe me. People ask me if I have any regrets about all this, and yes, I do. I regret not growing up sooner. I regret not listening to my grandfather when I had the chance. And I regret not being a man when my wife needed me to be. Life gave me a series of tests, and I failed. And the weirdest part is that it happened because I guessed wrong about Dogman and dinosaurs. No matter if you like it off or if you like it on, it's hard to find an EP who is really quite like Bon. Our executive producer for today is known as The Bon Dinkley. They're quite nice for supporting us, at least that's what we thinkly. Please join us in thanking today's executive producer Bon Dinkley for making this episode possible. In exchange, they get to see our secret uncensored stories, like the one we did this past Sunday where this guy... Well, actually, I can't tell you that story on this channel. You would either have to join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com, or do what Bon Dinkley did and click the join link under this or any of our videos to become a channel member. And now here's our TV spokesdog Henry Lee Dogman to fill in the rest of the details. Hank? Thanks for watching till the end. If you liked what you saw, please consider clicking like on the video or sharing it with your friends and family that you think might also be interested. If you would like to see more of our work, please consider subscribing and hitting that bell icon next to the subscribe button so that YouTube will alert you when we put out a new video. To become a channel member and gain access to our special perks, you can click that join link under each of our videos. Another option is to join our PayPal subscribers club at peterbernard.com. You can join for as little as 99 cents on YouTube or $1.50 at peterbernard.com, and that gains you access to our weekly secret uncensored episodes. If you'd like to see our 21 hours of archives of uncensored Dogman stories, then please join at the $3 level or above. To get to watch our shows in advance of the public, please join at our $10 level. That gets you all the perks. If you join our channel memberships, you need to check our community page here on YouTube in order to get the links to the secret videos and other perks. If you're in the PayPal subscribers club, Peter will email you all the news and links himself. Once joining the PayPal club, which is Peter's homemade club, please give him a chance to see that you've joined and to compose you a personal welcome email, as none of that is automated. But whichever you join, We'll name you an executive producer for the next available episode. Do you have a scary experience that you'd like to share with us? You can email us at scarystoriesnyc@gmail.com or call our Scary Stories voicemail hotline at 804-LA-SCARY. That's 804-537-2279. It's a Google voicemail box, so that means it keeps cutting off after every 3 minutes. If your story is longer than that, please keep calling back and we can piece it together on our end. Good night, and have a scary tomorrow.
Come back for more scary stories.